If you enjoy heartwarming stories that restore your faith in humanity, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss these incredible moments that remind us of the goodness in this world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as thousands of tourists gathered along the barriers, cameras ready, waiting for the iconic changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Among the crowd stood the Morrison family, who had traveled all the way from a small town in Yorkshire for this special trip. But this was not just any family vacation. This journey had been planned for months, saved for penny by penny. All for one reason: 8-year-old Thomas Morrison. Thomas sat in his wheelchair at the front of the crowd, his small hands gripping the armrests with excitement. His bright blue eyes sparkled with anticipation as he craned his neck to get a better view. Unlike the other children around him, who bounced on their feet or sat on their parents' shoulders, Thomas could only observe from his seated position. He had been born with a rare form of muscular dystrophy that had gradually weakened his legs until, by the age of 5, he could no longer walk at all. But Thomas never let his wheelchair define him. His mother, Sarah, often said he had the biggest heart and the brightest smile of any child she had ever known. His father, Michael, would add that Thomas had more courage in his little finger than most adults had in their entire bodies. And his older sister, Emma, who was 12, was fiercely protective of her little brother, always making sure he was included in everything and never treated differently. Thomas had become fascinated with the Royal Guards. After watching a documentary at school, he was mesmerized by their perfect posture, their unwavering discipline, and the way they marched in perfect synchronization. He had asked his teacher hundreds of questions about them. How long did they train? How heavy were their bearskin hats? Did their feet ever hurt from standing so still? His teacher had answered what she could, but many questions remained mysteries to young Thomas. For weeks, Thomas had talked about nothing else but the guards. He had drawn pictures of them in his art class, written stories about them for his homework, and even dressed up as one for Halloween. Sitting proudly in his wheelchair with a homemade red jacket and a tall black paper hat, his bedroom walls were covered with posters and photographs of the guards standing outside Buckingham Palace. One evening, as Sarah tucked Thomas into bed, he had looked up at her with those earnest blue eyes and whispered a confession that broke her heart. He told her that every night before he fell asleep, he closed his eyes and imagined himself walking alongside the guards, matching their stride, standing tall and proud. He said he knew it was impossible, but it was his favorite dream. Sarah had held back tears as she kissed his forehead goodnight. That conversation had prompted her and Michael to start planning this trip. They could not make Thomas walk, but they could give him the next best thing: seeing his heroes up close. Experiencing the ceremony in person, being part of that magical tradition, even if only as a spectator, the family had saved for 7 months. Michael had taken extra shifts at the factory where he worked. Sarah had taken on additional cleaning jobs in the evenings. Emma had contributed money from her birthday and Christmas gifts. They had all agreed that giving Thomas this experience was worth every sacrifice. Now, finally, they were here. The morning air was crisp and cool, and the excitement in the crowd was palpable. Thomas's hands trembled slightly, not from his condition, but from pure anticipation. He had barely slept the night before, too excited to close his eyes. He had woken his parents up at 5 in the morning, insisting they needed to leave early to get a good spot. Michael stood behind Thomas's wheelchair, one hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. Sarah stood beside them, her phone ready to capture every moment. Emma was on Thomas's other side, occasionally leaning down to point out interesting things in the crowd, or to share her excitement with her brother as they waited. Thomas struck up conversations with the other tourists around them. He told an elderly couple from Japan all about the history of the guards. He explained to a group of American teenagers that the bearskin hats were 18 inches tall and weighed about 1.5 pounds. He informed a family from Germany that the guards were real soldiers from elite regiments, not just ceremonial figures. His knowledge impressed everyone around him. And soon, a small circle of tourists were listening to the young boy in the wheelchair share his encyclopedic knowledge about the Royal Guards. A street vendor selling Union Jack flags approached the crowd, Emma quickly bought one for Thomas, who clutched it tightly in his hands, waving it gently. His face was flushed with happiness, his smile so wide it seemed to light up the entire street. Then, in the distance, they heard it, the sound of drums and music. The band was approaching. The ceremony was about to begin. Thomas sat up straighter in his wheelchair, his entire body tense with anticipation. This was the moment he had been dreaming about for months. But what Thomas did not know was that this day would become more than just a dream come true. What was about to happen would change not only his life, but touch the hearts of millions around the world. Sometimes, the universe has a way of delivering magic when we least expect it. And for Thomas Morrison, that magic was just moments away. The sound of the approaching band grew louder. The crowd pressed forward slightly, everyone eager to catch the first glimpse of the guards. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the sides of his wheelchair. His father placed both hands on the handles, ready to lift the front wheels slightly if needed, to give Thomas a better view over the taller people in front. Then they appeared. Row after row of guards in their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats, marching in perfect formation. Their black boots hit the cobblestones in perfect unison, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the street. The band played traditional military music, the brass instruments gleaming in the morning sunlight. It was more magnificent than anything Thomas had seen in pictures or videos. Thomas's mouth hung open in wonder. Tears welled up in his eyes, but they were tears of pure joy. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The precision, the discipline, the sheer magnificence of it all overwhelmed his young heart. Sarah noticed her son's tears and felt her own eyes filling up. She reached down and squeezed his shoulder gently. The guards marched past, their faces stern and focused, eyes fixed straight ahead. Thomas watched each one, trying to memorize every detail. The way their arms swung at exactly the same angle, the way their feet lifted to precisely the same height, the way the medals on their chests caught the light. He noticed everything, storing each observation away like precious treasures as the main body of guards passed. Thomas noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. One of the guards, a tall man with kind eyes, had glanced in his direction. It was just a fraction of a second, the slightest movement of the eyes, but Thomas had seen it. The guard had looked directly at him, sitting there in his wheelchair. Waving his Union Jack, flag with all the enthusiasm his small arms could muster, the ceremony continued with all its traditional pomp and circumstance. The old guard handed over responsibility to the new guard. Commands were shouted. Rifles were presented. The band played God Save the King. Thomas absorbed every moment, his face a picture of complete concentration and happiness. This was everything he had hoped for and more. But then something unexpected happened. As the ceremony was concluding and the crowds were beginning to disperse, Thomas noticed movement at the edge of the palace courtyard. The same guard who had glanced at him earlier was speaking with an officer. Both men were looking in Thomas's direction. The officer nodded and the guard broke formation. Walking purposefully toward the barrier where Thomas and his family stood, the crowd around them noticed and began to murmur. It was highly unusual for a guard to break formation and approach spectators. People pulled out their phones, sensing that something special was about to happen. Michael and Sarah exchanged confused glances. Wondering what was going on, the guard approached the barrier and stopped directly in front of Thomas. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance. He stood at attention, his bearskin hat adding height to his already tall frame. For a moment, he simply looked down at Thomas with an expression that was hard to read behind his formal, disciplined exterior. Then slowly, the guard's stern expression softened. He knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to Thomas's eye level. The crowd fell silent, everyone straining to see what was happening. The guard reached out and gently touched the wheel of Thomas's chair, and when he spoke, his voice was warm and kind. A stark contrast to the commanding tones he had been using during the ceremony. He told Thomas that he had noticed him in the crowd, had seen the joy and admiration in his eyes. He said that in all his years of service, He had never seen anyone watch the ceremony with such genuine appreciation and enthusiasm. He asked Thomas if he knew much about the guards, and Thomas, finding his voice despite his nervousness, began to share all the facts he had learned. The guard listened patiently, nodding and smiling as Thomas rattled off information about the regiments, the history, the traditions. Other guards had now gathered nearby, watching the interaction with warm expressions. Several of them were smiling, clearly touched by the young boy's passion and knowledge. Then the guard asked Thomas a question that made his heart stop. He asked if Thomas would like to come closer, to cross the barrier and see the guards up close. He explained that it was not something they normally did, that Thomas was clearly special. And today was going to be a special day. Thomas looked up at his parents, his eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and Michael simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Emma grabbed her brother's hand and squeezed it tightly, sharing in his excitement. The guard stood up and gestured to his fellow soldiers. Two of them approached and, with the help of Michael, carefully lifted Thomas's wheelchair over the barrier. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. People were filming on their phones, capturing this unexpected and beautiful moment. Thomas found himself on the other side of the barrier, in the space that had always seemed so distant and unreachable. He was surrounded by the royal guards, the men he had admired from afar for so long. They stood around him in a semicircle, all of them smiling down at him with genuine warmth. But what happened next would be the moment that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. The moment that would spread across social media and news outlets around the world. The moment that would remind millions of people that kindness and compassion are the greatest strengths of all. The guard who had first approached Thomas knelt down again and looked into his eyes with a seriousness that commanded attention. He introduced himself as Sergeant James Matthews of the Grenadier Guards, and he told Thomas that he had served for 15 years. He said that being a guard required strength, discipline, and courage. Then he said something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Sergeant Matthews said that he had seen many people watch the ceremony over the years, but he had never seen someone display the kind of courage and strength that Thomas showed every single day. He said that, sitting in that wheelchair, facing life's challenges with a smile, knowing everything about the guards, even though he could not walk among them, showed more bravery than most soldiers would ever need in their entire careers. Thomas felt tears rolling down his cheeks. But he was not embarrassed. These were different tears now. They were tears of being seen, of being understood, of being valued, not despite his wheelchair, but as a complete person. His mother was crying too, and his father had to turn away to wipe his eyes. Emma stood frozen, her phone recording everything, tears streaming down her own face. Then Sergeant Matthews stood up and did something that no one expected. He removed his bearskin hat, the iconic symbol of the Royal Guards, and placed it gently on Thomas's head. It was far too big, of course, sliding down almost over Thomas's eyes. But the boy reached up and held it in place, his small hands trembling with emotion. The crowd behind the barrier erupted into cheers and applause so loud it echoed off the palace walls. Tourists who had been about to leave stopped in their tracks and pulled out their phones. Within minutes, dozens of people were live streaming the moment to social media. But Thomas barely heard any of it. He was lost in his own world, feeling the weight of the hat on his head. A weight that felt like honor and acceptance and belonging all at once. But Sergeant Matthews was not finished. He turned to his fellow guards and gave a command. Immediately, 6 guards stepped forward and formed 2 lines, 3 on each side of Thomas's wheelchair. They stood at attention, creating an honor guard formation with Thomas at the center. Sergeant Matthews walked to the back of Thomas's wheelchair and leaned down to speak quietly in his ear. He told Thomas that he may not be able to walk, but today he was going to march with the Royal Guards. He asked Thomas if he was ready, and Thomas, unable to speak through his tears and emotion, simply nodded his head vigorously. What happened next became one of the most viewed videos on the internet that year. Sergeant Matthews gripped the handles of Thomas's wheelchair, called out a command, and began to push Thomas forward. The 6 guards beside them began to march, their feet moving in perfect synchronization. They marched across the courtyard, past the palace, in full ceremonial formation. Thomas sat up as straight as he could in his wheelchair, small hands still holding the oversized bearskin hat on his head. The guards beside him swung their arms in perfect formation, their boots striking the ground in rhythm, and in the middle, being pushed by a sergeant of the Grenadier Guards, was a small boy in a wheelchair who had dreamed of this moment. Every night before falling asleep, the crowd watched in absolute silence, many people openly weeping. Even the guards who were not part of the formation stood with their hands behind their backs, watching with evident emotion on their normally stoic faces. This was not in any manual or protocol. This was pure human compassion, the kind that transcends rules and regulations, the kind that reminds us why traditions matter, not for their rigidity, but for the values they represent. They marched for nearly 2 minutes, covering the length of the courtyard. To Thomas, it felt like both an eternity and a single heartbeat. Every second was precious. Every moment burned into his memory with perfect clarity. The sound of the boots on the stone, the feeling of moving forward, surrounded by these magnificent soldiers, the weight of the hat on his head, the sun warm on his face. The knowledge that he was not just watching the guards, but was, in this moment, part of them. When they reached the end of the courtyard, the guards came to a halt in perfect unison. They turned inward to face Thomas, and, as one, they saluted him. Not the casual salute one might give a child to make them smile, but a proper military salute. Given with the full respect they would show to a superior officer, Thomas, through his tears, lifted his small hand to his forehead and returned the salute as best he could. It was not perfect or practiced, but it came from his heart, and that made it the most meaningful salute any of these soldiers had ever received. Sergeant Matthews knelt beside Thomas one more time and carefully removed the bearskin hat from his head. But before he placed it back on his own head, he turned it around to show Thomas something. Inside the hat, embroidered in small gold letters, was his name and regiment. He told Thomas that this hat had been with him through ceremonies around the world, through rain and sun, through countless hours of service. Then he asked Thomas for his address. Confused but obedient, Thomas recited his home address in Yorkshire. Sergeant Matthews pulled out a small notebook and wrote it down carefully. He told Thomas to keep watching his mailbox, because something special would be arriving soon. He would not say what, only that it was something Thomas could keep forever. As the guards helped lift Thomas's wheelchair back over the barrier to his family, the crowd surrounded them with cheers and applause. Complete strangers were wiping tears from their eyes, patting Michael on the back and telling Sarah what a special son she had. Emma stood close to her brother, fiercely proud, making sure no one crowded him too much. The family stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Thomas sat quietly in his wheelchair, staring at his hands as if he could still feel the weight of the bearskin hat. His face was streaked with tears, but his smile was radiant, brighter than his family had ever seen it. Sarah knelt in front of him and asked if he was okay, and Thomas simply nodded, unable to find words big enough for what he was feeling, as they finally began to make their way through the crowd. People stopped them repeatedly. Tourists asked if they could take pictures with Thomas, and he graciously agreed to each one. Still too overwhelmed to speak much, but nodding and smiling. Several people handed Michael business cards saying they had filmed the whole thing and wanted to send the family copies of the videos. Michael thanked them politely, not quite understanding the significance. He and Sarah were not people who spent much time on social media. They had Facebook accounts they rarely checked, and had never heard of TikTok or Instagram Reels. They had no idea that at that very moment, videos of Thomas marching with the Royal Guards were being uploaded to every social media platform imaginable. The first video was posted by a tourist from Australia who had been live streaming the ceremony. Within 30 minutes, it had 10,000 views. Within an hour, it had 100,000. By the time the Morrison family sat down for lunch at a nearby cafe, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. And that was just one of many videos being shared. The family spent the rest of the day exploring London, visiting the sites they had planned. They went to the Tower of London, walked along the Thames, and had fish and chips for dinner. Thomas was quieter than usual, clearly still processing the morning's events. Every so often, he would reach up and touch his head, as if checking to see if the bearskin hat was still there. That evening, back at their modest hotel room, Emma convinced her parents to let her check social media on her phone. She had promised her friends she would post pictures from the trip. When she opened Instagram, her jaw dropped. Her feed was filled with videos of her brother. She scrolled through TikTok and found the same thing. She checked Twitter and Facebook, and it was everywhere. With shaking hands, she showed her parents. Sarah gasped, and Michael sat down heavily on the bed, stunned. The videos had been viewed tens of millions of times across all platforms. News outlets were picking up the story. The headline, "Wheelchair Boy's Dream Comes True," at Buckingham Palace was trending worldwide. Comments poured in by the thousands, each one more touching than the last. People from every corner of the globe were sharing the video, adding their own stories of overcoming challenges, thanking the guards for their compassion, praising Thomas for his courage. Parents of children with disabilities were crying as they watched, feeling seen and validated. Military members were commenting about how this was what true service looked like. Complete strangers were saying they had watched the video 10 times and cried every single time. Thomas, exhausted from the day's emotions, had already fallen asleep in his bed. Sarah stood over him, watching his peaceful face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought about all the challenges they had faced as a family. All the surgeries, the therapies, the heartbreaking moments when Thomas had asked why he could not run like other children. She thought about all the times people had stared at his wheelchair with pity, all the times he had been left out or overlooked, and now the world was seeing what she had always known, that her son was extraordinary. Not in spite of his wheelchair, but because of who he was as a person. His courage, his knowledge, his enthusiasm, his pure heart, these were the things that had moved Sergeant Matthews to break protocol and create that magical moment. The next morning, the family woke to discover that the story had grown even bigger overnight. British newspapers had run front-page stories about it. American morning shows were discussing it. The video had been viewed over 50 million times. The hotel staff recognized Thomas at breakfast and gave him free pastries, telling him he was a hero. Michael's phone, which he had left on silent, had dozens of missed calls from numbers he did not recognize. News organizations wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted the family to appear. A children's hospital wanted to know if Thomas would visit to inspire their patients. It was overwhelming and surreal. Through it all, Thomas remained the same sweet, humble boy he had always been. When a reporter from the local news finally caught up with them outside the hotel and asked how it felt to be famous, Thomas simply said that he was not famous. The guards were famous. He said they were the real heroes, and he was just lucky to have met them. That quote, captured on video, went viral too. People praised his humility, his perspective, his wisdom beyond his years. The original videos were now being viewed over 100 million times combined. But for Thomas, none of that mattered as much as the memory of marching with the guards, of feeling their respect, of being treated not as someone to be pitied, but as someone to be honored. The family cut their London trip short by a day. Not because they wanted to, but because the attention had become too intense. Strangers were recognizing Thomas on the street. Photographers were following them. While everyone was kind and well-meaning, it was exhausting for a family that valued their privacy and quiet life. On the train ride back to Yorkshire, Thomas stared out the window, watching the countryside roll by. Emma sat beside him, her hand in his. Michael and Sarah sat across from them, holding hands, occasionally wiping away fresh tears as they reflected on the past 2 days. Sarah leaned forward and asked Thomas what he was thinking about. He turned to her with that same bright smile and said he was thinking about what Sergeant Matthews had said. It's about courage and strength. He said he had never thought of himself as brave before, but maybe he was. Maybe they all were. Life slowly returned to normal for the Morrison family after they returned home to Yorkshire. The media attention gradually faded. Though people in their small towns still recognized Thomas and would smile and wave when they saw him, His school had held a special assembly where the headmaster had shown the video to all the students and staff, many of whom cried watching it. Thomas had been embarrassed by the attention, but secretly pleased when his classmates treated him like a celebrity for a few days. 3 weeks after their London trip, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the postman knocked on the Morrisons' door instead of just leaving the mail in the slot. He handed Sarah a large, official-looking package with a return address from the Ministry of Defense. Her hands trembled as she signed for it. She called for Thomas, who wheeled himself quickly from his bedroom, curious about the excitement in his mother's voice. Michael was still at work, and Emma was at school. Sarah carefully opened the package at the kitchen table while Thomas watched with wide eyes. Inside was a letter on official letterhead, and beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper, was something that made both Sarah and Thomas gasp. It was a miniature bearskin hat, professionally made, exactly like the ones the guards wore, but perfectly sized for Thomas. It was beautiful with every detail correct. From the chin strap to the brass fittings, with shaking hands, Sarah unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. It was from Sergeant James Matthews. He wrote that the package had taken time to prepare because he wanted everything to be perfect. He explained that the miniature hat had been specially commissioned and was an exact replica of the ones worn by the Grenadier Guards. He said that Thomas had earned the right to wear it through his courage, his passion, and his spirit. But there was more. The letter continued, explaining that Thomas's story had touched not just the soldiers who had been there that day, but the entire regiment. It had spread throughout the British Armed Forces and had been discussed at the highest levels of command. The soldiers wanted Thomas to know that they considered him an honorary member of the Grenadier Guards. Sarah's voice broke as she read the next part. The letter stated that a formal ceremony was being planned for the following month. Thomas and his family were invited to the Guards barracks for an official event where Thomas would be presented with a certificate of honorary membership and would meet with more of the soldiers. Transportation and accommodation would be provided for the entire family. Thomas sat in stunned silence, the small bearskin hat cradled in his lap. He ran his fingers over it gently, as if it might disappear if he touched it too hard. When he finally looked up at his mother, his eyes were filled with tears. But his smile was pure joy. Sarah immediately called Michael at work, barely able to speak through her emotions as she explained what had arrived. Michael asked his supervisor if he could leave early, and within an hour, he was home, holding the letter and the hat, shaking his head in disbelief at the kindness of strangers. When Emma came home from school, she burst into tears the moment she saw the hat. She'd been so proud of her little brother throughout this whole experience, and seeing how much the guards valued him filled her heart to overflowing. She insisted on taking dozens of pictures of Thomas wearing his new hat, which he wore proudly for the rest of the evening that night. Thomas asked if he could sleep with the hat on his bedside table, and Sarah agreed. As she tucked him in, he told her something that made her weep. He said that he used to dream about walking beside the guards, but now he did not need to anymore. He said he had learned something important. That being brave was not about walking or standing or doing everything other people could do. It was about being yourself and not giving up and finding joy even when things were hard. Sarah kissed his forehead and told him she could not be prouder of the person he was becoming. She said that he had taught her more about courage than she had ever taught him. The news of the upcoming ceremony leaked somehow, and the media attention briefly flared up again. But this time, the family was better prepared. They declined most interview requests, but agreed to one with a local news station that had always treated them respectfully. During the interview, Thomas wore his miniature bearskin hat and spoke eloquently about what the guards' kindness had meant to him. He said something during that interview that resonated with millions of people who saw it. He said that everyone has their own kind of wheelchair, something that makes life harder or different than what they expected. But what matters is not the wheelchair, he said. What matters is where you are trying to go and who you meet along the way. His words were wise beyond his 8 years, born from real experience and genuine reflection. Teachers began using the video of his interview in their classrooms to teach about empathy and resilience. Therapists shared it with their patients. Parents showed it to their children to help them understand differences. As the date of the ceremony approached, The Morrison family received hundreds of letters from people around the world. Some were from children with disabilities who said Thomas had inspired them. Others were from soldiers who thanked the family for reminding them why they served. Many were from parents who said watching the videos had made them appreciate their own children more. Sarah kept every letter in a special box, knowing that someday Thomas would want to read them all and understand just how far his kindness and courage had reached. One letter from a mother in America whose son also used a wheelchair particularly moved her. The mother wrote that her son had watched the video of Thomas marching with the guards over 100 times, and that it had given him hope during a difficult period of surgeries. The night before the ceremony, the whole family sat together in the living room. Emma had made a special dinner, Michael's favorite roast chicken. They talked about how their lives had changed in just a few weeks, about the unexpected turns life can take, about the kindness of strangers who become friends. Thomas sat quietly for most of the dinner, clearly deep in thought. When Emma asked what he was thinking about, he said he was thinking about Sergeant Matthews and the other guards. He said he wanted to do something special for them, to thank them the way they had thanked him. The ceremony at the guards' barracks was scheduled for a Saturday morning, and the Morrison family arrived the evening before, staying in a hotel provided by the regiment. Thomas barely slept, too excited and nervous about what the next day would bring. He kept his miniature bearskin hat on the pillow beside him, occasionally reaching out to touch it to make sure it was real. When they arrived at the barracks the next morning, they were greeted by Sergeant Matthews himself, looking just as impressive in his formal uniform as he had that day at Buckingham Palace. But this time, when he saw Thomas, his formal military bearing melted into a warm smile. He shook hands with Michael and Sarah, gave Emma a respectful nod, and then knelt down to talk to Thomas directly. He asked Thomas how he had been, if he had been practicing his marching, and if he liked the hat. Thomas, less shy now, told him enthusiastically that he wore the hat every day after school and had learned everything he could about the Grenadier Guards' history. Sergeant Matthews laughed warmly and said he expected nothing less from their newest honorary member. The family was led into a large, ceremonial hall where dozens of guards stood in formation, along with several high-ranking officers and, to the family's surprise, members of the press who had been specially permitted to document the event. But these were not the aggressive tabloid photographers they had encountered before. These were official military photographers and a few carefully selected journalists who understood the significance of the moment. The ceremony began with formal military precision. Commands were called out, and the guards moved in perfect synchronization. Thomas watched with the same rapt attention he had shown at Buckingham Palace, his eyes trying to absorb every detail. But this time, he was not just a spectator. He was the guest of honor. A colonel stepped forward and began to speak. He talked about the values that the guards represented: duty, honor, courage, and service. He said that these values were not limited to those who wore the uniform, but were found in all sorts of people, including a young boy from Yorkshire, who faced each day with remarkable bravery. He spoke about how Thomas's story had reminded the entire regiment of why they served, not for glory or recognition, but to protect and honor those who showed the best of humanity. He said that in Thomas. They saw a reflection of the courage they aspired to embody. Then came the moment Thomas had been waiting for. He was called forward, and with Sergeant Matthews pushing his wheelchair, he moved to the center of the hall. The colonel presented him with a beautifully framed certificate, declaring him an honorary junior member of the Grenadier Guards. The document bore official seals and signatures, including that of the regiment's commanding officer. But there was more. The guards had also created a special uniform jacket for Thomas, scaled to his size in the distinctive red of the Grenadier Guards. It had been tailored specifically for him, designed to fit comfortably over his seated position. When they helped him put it on, along with his miniature bearskin hat, the entire room erupted in applause. Thomas looked down at himself in wonder, touching the brass buttons, feeling the quality fabric. Then he looked up at the guards surrounding him, all of them smiling, many with visible emotion in their eyes. In that moment, Thomas felt something he had never quite felt before. He felt like he truly belonged, exactly as he was. The ceremony continued with formal photographs, but then something unexpected happened. Sergeant Matthews announced that they had one more surprise. The large doors at the end of the hall opened, and in wheeled a fleet of children, some in wheelchairs like Thomas, others with different disabilities, all wearing matching red caps that identified them as guests of the regiment. Sergeant Matthews explained that Thomas's story had inspired the regiment to create a new program. Several times a year, they would host children with disabilities and their families, giving them the same honor and experience they had given Thomas. They wanted to ensure that every child who dreamed of being a guard, regardless of their physical abilities, knew that courage came in all forms. Thomas was speechless. His mother openly wept. The other children looked at Thomas with admiration, and several of them wheeled over to introduce themselves. In minutes, Thomas was surrounded by new friends, all of them excited and chattering about the guards and the ceremony. The formal part of the event concluded with all the children, including Thomas, being given a special tour of the barracks. The guards showed them the history, the traditions, the equipment. They let the children try on parts of the uniform, hold the ceremonial rifles unloaded, of course, and ask a million questions, which the soldiers answered with patience and enthusiasm. At one point during the tour, Thomas found himself alone for a moment with Sergeant Matthews. He pulled out something from his pocket, a small drawing he had made the night before. It showed the guards marching with him in the middle, and at the top, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for seeing me." Sergeant Matthews took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. He studied it for a long moment, and when he looked back at Thomas, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He told Thomas that this drawing would go in a frame on his desk, where he would see it every single day. He said it would remind him why he had chosen this life of service. Then Sergeant Matthews shared something personal. He told Thomas that he had a nephew who had been born with cerebral palsy. He said that when he saw Thomas in the crowd that day at Buckingham Palace, he had thought of his nephew who was too shy to pursue his own dreams because he felt different. He said that helping Thomas had been his way of honoring his nephew and all the children who felt limited by their circumstances. Thomas listened quietly, then reached out and took Sergeant Matthews's hand. He told him that his nephew should know that being different was not the same as being less. He said that everyone has something special to offer, and sometimes the people who face the biggest challenges have the biggest hearts. Those words, coming from an 8-year-old boy, struck Sergeant Matthews deeply. He promised Thomas that he would share that message with his nephew, and that, if Thomas agreed, he would like the two boys to meet someday. Thomas's face lit up at the idea, and he nodded enthusiastically. As the day drew to a close, and the families prepared to leave, something remarkable happened. The children who had attended the ceremony did not want to go. They had formed bonds with each other and with the guards who had shown them such respect and kindness. Parents exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch. The guards gave each child a small pin featuring the regiment's insignia, telling them they were always part of the family now. Before the Morrison family left, the colonel pulled them aside and told them something that made their long journey full circle. He said that the regiment had been so moved by the response to Thomas's story that they were establishing a formal charitable foundation. It would be called the Thomas Morrison Courage Foundation, and it would work to provide experiences and support for children with disabilities throughout the United Kingdom. Sarah gasped and looked at her son, who sat quietly processing this information. The colonel continued, explaining that they did not need the family's permission to use Thomas's name, but they wanted their blessing. He said that Thomas had shown them what true courage looked like, and they wanted to honor that by helping other children discover their own strength. Michael, speaking for the family, said they would be honored. Thomas simply nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak, but his smile said everything that needed to be said. On the drive home that evening, the family was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma held her brother's hand in the back seat, occasionally squeezing it gently. Thomas stared out the window, his miniature bearskin hat on his lap, his new uniform jacket carefully folded beside him. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. She asked Thomas what he was thinking about. He turned to her with that bright, beautiful smile that had captured the hearts of millions, and said something that perfectly captured the wisdom he had gained from this experience. He said that he used to think his wheelchair made him different in a bad way, like he was broken or less than other people. But now he understood that everyone is different in some way, and those differences are what make people special. He said the guards had not helped him despite his wheelchair, but had honored him for everything he was, wheelchair included. He said he had learned that the world was full of kind people, that dreams could come true in unexpected ways, and that sometimes the things you think make you weak are actually what make you strong. He said he still could not walk, and that was okay. Because he had learned to march in his own way, Emma hugged her brother tightly, and Michael had to pull the car over for a moment because his eyes were too full of tears to see the road clearly. Sarah turned around in her seat and looked at her son, this remarkable child who had taught so many people about courage and grace. That night, Sarah tucked Thomas into bed. He asked her one more question. He wanted to know if she thought other kids like him, kids in wheelchairs, or with other challenges, would see what had happened and feel better about themselves. Sarah assured him that they already had, that his story had touched millions of people around the world. Thomas smiled and closed his eyes, finally content. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the emotional day, his miniature bearskin hat on the nightstand beside him, catching the moonlight that filtered through his window. The next morning, the family woke to news that the video of the ceremony had been released by the Ministry of Defense and was already being viewed millions of times. But this time, the family was not overwhelmed by it. They understood now that Thomas's story had become bigger than just one boy's dream coming true. It had become a reminder to the world about the power of compassion, the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, and the extraordinary courage that exists in ordinary lives. Years would pass, and the Thomas Morrison Courage Foundation would help thousands of children. Thomas would grow up, graduate from school, and eventually go to university. He would maintain his friendship with Sergeant Matthews and meet many other guards over the years. He would give speeches about disability awareness and become an advocate for inclusive education. But whenever anyone asked him about the most important moment of his life, he would always come back to that day at Buckingham Palace when a guard knelt down to his level, saw him not as a child in a wheelchair, but as a person worthy of honor and respect. That moment had changed everything, not by changing who Thomas was, but by showing him and the world who he had been all along, a young man of extraordinary courage, boundless enthusiasm, and a heart big enough to inspire millions.